Socialism Conference is the place in this country where we meet people who are involved in movement work, activist work on the ground in communities all across the country.
What I really love about Socialism Conference is that it's a space to be in community with other socialists, be in community with other people who are thinking about how do we actually build a movement for revolutionary and radical change in the world, and also just to have fun and hear about some of the work that each other is doing, to be inspired.
There is nothing that recreates the experience of being in Rome and being able to fellowship, being able to share ideas, being able to feel each other's presence in the physical form. It allows for a different level of connection. It allows for energetic vibrations that can't be captured via Zoom or via teleconference.
It's an opportunity for us to meet like-minded people. While we have a million differences, we're all in the struggle to make a better world, to make a world of balance and peace and justice and joy. And I find comrades here every time I come.
It's a place where we can dream about abolition and think about how we're going to create campaigns, how we're going to deconstruct the state while we're simultaneously creating the communities and care we need for all to survive and thrive.
If you are in any form of radical politics, movement building, art practice, facilitation, healing, restorative work, I don't know of another gathering that happens like this that puts those entities together. And it's not just an elitist conference. A lot of times you can go to a space like this and there's a lot of top line names and everyone else feels like an audience. But here this feels like a community co-learning and interacting with each other.
If you are a person that's trying to figure out how we can prioritize putting people over profit instead of profit over people, if you're a person that believes in racial justice and the social good, socialism might be a place where you could find your folks.
If you believe that we deserve a world where people are cared for, where people's needs are met, and where people can truly self-determine, socialism is a conference for you. This space will help connect you to those people for you to grow and build with for years to come.
I don't understand how we can ultimately dismantle any of it if we don't stick to a intensely radical politics.
You're not broke if you're taxing rich people.
We break production for profit and we replace it by production for need.
This event is brought to you by Haymarket Books. Now more than ever, it is critical to support independent publishers, independent bookstores, and independent voices. There are two ways you can do this today. First, by buying books from Haymarket at haymarketbooks.org. And secondly, by joining the Haymarket Book Club. The following event will be recorded and shared afterwards on the Haymarket Books YouTube channel. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video now, and share it with as many people as possible. If you like this event, be sure to catch these upcoming events in Haymarket's live stream series. You can register for these upcoming events on the Haymarket Books Eventbrite page. If you miss an event, you can listen to the recording afterward by subscribing to our podcast, Haymarket Live, wherever you get your podcasts. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. We are moderating the chat, but we cannot guarantee that everyone will observe our community guidelines. People who violate these guidelines will have their comments deleted as quickly as we are able. This event will have live closed captions. Instructions for accessing the captions will be posted in the chat. We should have time for Q&A, so please post your questions in the YouTube chat window, and we'll get to those later in the program. Thanks for joining us today. Our event will begin shortly.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Sandra, and I'm joining you from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada today. I'm moderating the panel, and I'm looking forward to a really rich discussion today. Before I introduce our panelists, let me briefly outline how we will proceed. Each speaker has been asked to keep their remarks to about 12 minutes, and then I will take questions from the audience and relay them to the panelists for comment and discussion. I'm really delighted with our panelists today and excited in a good way, although I wish we weren't still having this conversation 3 years on, to hear from them and also to hear from the audience your thoughts. Simon is joining us today, is an honorary professor at the University of Durham in the UK and a lifelong activist in the labor movement. He has been traveling to and writing about Russia and Ukraine since 1990 and writes a blog at peoplenature.org. Hanna is a historian from Donetsk, Ukraine, currently based in Europe, and is working on the 1917 revolution and the place of Ukraine in the Russian political imaginary. She is involved in various European left-wing solidarity initiatives with Ukraine and Russian anti-war activists. And Ilya is a political theorist and activist from Russia, a visiting scholar with the program in critical theory at UC Berkeley, and author of Dissidents Among Dissidents, Ideology, Politics, and the Left in Post-Soviet Russia. He is a member of the editorial board of the Russian socialist website Posle Media. So welcome to the panelists. We are going to go in the order of introduction. And Simon, I invite you to start us off with about 12 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Sandra, and thank you for inviting me to join the panel. I'm going to offer some comments about, first, the Western government's attitude to the war in Ukraine, and second, the part played in this by the labor movement and social movements in Western countries. And I think Hanna and Ilya will go on to tell you about what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. About the Western powers, first, the ruling elites of those powers are divided about the war. And in my view, the best way to understand this is to think not about good policies and bad policies, but about attitudes to Russia. It's Russia, a great power with oil, gas, minerals, and nuclear weapons that they care about, rather than Ukraine or any other smaller country. Now, if we go back to the time when Putin became president in 2000, then the Western powers were much more united in the view that the Russian government should be pulled closer politically and diplomatically. At that time, Putin was treated as an ally in the so-called war on terror. The Western powers, who were themselves embroiled in Iraq, ignored or even supported Putin's onslaught on Chechnya and the multiple war crimes committed in the course of that. The expansion of NATO, which has been used as a false pretext to justify Russian aggression against Ukraine, had already at that time reached its peak. 7 Eastern European countries were admitted in 2004, and between then and 2022, only 4 of the very smallest countries in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, were admitted. So the main job of expanding NATO had already been done. And in fact, at that time, Putin, who regularly spoke with Tony Blair and the other leaders, there was even talk, I'm not sure it was going to happen, but there was even talk of Russia being admitted to NATO. So why did the Western powers' attitude change? It changed because the Kremlin changed. and the Kremlin changed in the fallout from the world economic crisis of 2008 to 2009. Russia's economic position as a subordinate, second-rate power which supplied oil, gas, and minerals to the world economy weakened further, and the elite, the Kremlin, reacted in the way that imperial elites react. It ramped up repression at home, and in 2014, when the government of Yanukovych was overthrown in Ukraine, supported the Eastern Ukrainian separatists and invaded Ukraine. The Western powers generally turned a blind eye to Russian terrorism in Donetsk and Luhansk, not to mention Syria, where Russia was also invading at that time. But the Western powers saw the annexation of Crimea as a violation of international agreements that they could not tolerate. And in fact, if you look at the small print of all the sanctions that were imposed on Russia in 2014, they all relate to Crimea, not to any of the terrible things that were happening in the Donbass. In the Western powers' view, Putin had not to be stopped, but to be compelled to play by their rules. And right up until 2021, the Western powers negotiated with Russia about how these rules would be applied, for example, to the Russian gas trade with European countries. The key to Western policy remained the post-Soviet integration of Russia into the world economy as a supplier of raw materials. In 2022, the Western powers were again forced to change their approach, sharply but not completely, in response to the Kremlin's action, this time the full-scale invasion. Politically, they could not tolerate a war in Europe. But even then, many of them did not give up their hope of controlling rather than defeating the Kremlin. And a wide range of sanctions have been imposed on Russia. But if you look at the actions of the US administration in imposing those sanctions, it has been consistent in ensuring that it would not drive the price of oil up above $60 a barrel. That's how much they value the support that they're giving to Ukraine. They have opposed sanctions on Western firms that ensure Russian oil tankers and sanctions on oil products that have been refined from Russian crude oil in Asian countries. For similar reasons, the US has limited the supply of weapons to Ukraine, not only missiles that can be used to strike military targets in Russia, but crucially, defensive weapons. And that has facilitated the Russian assault on Ukraine's electricity generation network this year, which threatens a humanitarian disaster in the winter. Now, you've all read in the newspapers that Putin is hoping that Trump will be elected as US president. And in my view, that's, especially looking at the debate last night, that seems quite possible and might indeed cause Ukraine additional problems. But we should not lose sight of the other factors, including, first, Trump's Russia policy may be more chaotic than his rhetoric would have you believe. Second, is the fault lines running through Western policy as a whole and the divisions among European political leaders that will determine their attitude, not only what happens in the US. And therefore, third, some or all of the problems that Ukrainians fear could arise under Trump could arise even if Biden beats Trump. And that includes shortage of weapons, curtailment of financial support, and pressure to accept a punitive peace agreement. I think some sort of wide peace agreement or treaty remains extremely unlikely. A more realistic possibility is the freezing of the conflict or a ceasefire, but the very first condition for any of those things, that both sides in the conflict want to talk about a peace settlement, is not being met. And Putin made that very clear at the time of the peace conference in Switzerland last month with his fantastical declaration demanding cessation of Ukrainian territory that Ukraine currently controls. Another possibility about which we must be honest is that given the logic of the Kremlin's policy, military aggression could expand beyond Ukraine. Now, there's a political point from this that the labor movement and civil society in Western countries, in my view, should welcome the supply of weapons to Ukrainians to defend themselves. Would that Palestinians had such weapons, but we should have no illusions about the motives of Western governments who supply these weapons. And I think for that reason, it's dangerous to frame this as an issue of totalitarianism versus democracy. This is the way that many European social democratic politicians, including here in the UK, have justified their support for Ukraine. But many of these same politicians have failed to oppose the delivery of arms to Israel, which are being used to perpetrate a genocide of even greater intensity than the Russian carnage in Ukraine. Some of these politicians have even actively supported Israel's onslaught on Gaza and participated in the witch hunt against those who speak up for Palestinian rights. In this way, they're nurturing another form of dictatorship in Netanyahu. In opposition to this sort of politics, we need to build a solidarity with the labor movement, with civil society in Ukraine, on the basis of rejecting military aggression from Russia and its allies, just as we reject it from Israel and its Western backers. So finally, about the labor movement and social movements in Western countries and our collective efforts, such as they've been, to build solidarity with Ukraine. There's been a long and angry conversation about the role of the so-called left and the prominence within it of campist arguments that Putin was forced into the war by NATO expansion and so on. I think answering these arguments is important, but not enough in itself. We need to question the left as a category. Does it mean anything? Is it any kind of force? What used to be called the left has changed because of the way our society has changed in the post-Soviet period, because of the relative decline of the old labor organizations and the emergence of new social movements and other factors. Politically, the campists are the direct descendants of Stalinists, those old Communist Party people who defended everything the Soviet Union did, including suppressing workers' movements in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. But sociologically, things have moved on. Those campists do not have the grip that the old communist parties had on parts of the European labour movement. And I think that their influence outside the formal structures of the labour movement is in many ways superficial. So here in the UK, there's a huge body of support for Ukraine, which exists completely outside the official labour movement. It's been an amazing thing to me to witness friends with Ukrainian collections organising collections of huge sums of money, whether for drones, for medical supplies, or for multiple other forms of support. In sharp contrast to that, the so-called Stop the War coalition, which exists within the official labour movement, dominated by the campists, does its best to silence those who support the right of Ukrainians to defend themselves in arms. But what we've seen over the last 7 or 8 months on the gigantic marches in London against Israeli aggression in Gaza and against UK government support for it, the atmosphere there is very, very different. A group of us have participated in those demonstrations with a banner which says, "From Ukraine to Palestine, occupation is a crime." And we've had an overwhelmingly warm reception from thousands and thousands and thousands of our fellow marchers who really have been brought onto the streets in fury about what's happening in Gaza, but also when confronted with that analogy, are very appreciative that we've made it. And perhaps the most important issue out of many issues in building solidarity with Ukraine in the coming period will be to find ways of communicating with the generation of young people that we've seen on those demonstrations, that we've seen in these student sit-ins in the Western countries who've been thrown into political activity for the first time around Gaza. I think there is an enormous opportunity for political progress and solidarity in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Hanna.
Yes. Do you hear me well? Okay. So today is 855th day since the start of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And I see that many people outside of Ukraine expect that Ukrainian society is tired of war, and the only thing that gets in the way of peace is actually the military ambitions of its leadership and Western countries. Well, I also think that most of the people who say Ukrainians are tired of this war if they are not Ukrainians themselves. Most of these people are those living in the United States or Europe and who actually never asked the opinion of any actual Ukrainians. What people actually mean when they are saying this is that they are tired of the intrusion of Ukraine in their personal lives. But if you want to understand better what Ukrainians are facing on this third year of Russian war of aggression, we can quickly take a look at an opinion poll that was conducted in March this year. The formula that would describe the general state of mind in today's Ukraine can be something like tired, pessimistic, but determined to win. And the share of Ukrainians who say to be ready to seek a compromise to end the war through negotiations fell from 43% to 26% this year. When respondents, they were asked actually to choose between negotiating with Russia and continuing to fight. It must be said, and it is visible in this survey, that Ukrainians say that they're open to negotiations, idea of negotiations as such, but they do not trust Russia to negotiate in good faith. So most Ukrainians believe that there is a high risk that Russia will attack again, even if there is a signed peace treaty, and even more that Russia's motives to enter negotiations is rather to take time to prepare for a new, bigger attack. Most Ukrainians, 83%, they oppose reducing Ukrainian military capabilities as a condition to end the war, and condition that was demanded by Russia. Majorities also opposed ending the war in the following scenarios. For example, a ceasefire that freezes the current front lines, 65% are opposed to it. Ukrainian renunciation of possible EU or NATO memberships, 65 and 60% are opposed. And the Russian withdrawal from the territory it has occupied since the full-scale invasion of 2022. So 46% are opposed to such a scenario. And I would also like to remind that the last Putin's peace proposal didn't just ask to recognize all the territories Russia has actually occupied, but also the territory that Russia proclaims as belonging to them, but these huge territories that it never managed to occupy. There is, however, also an issue that erodes the Ukrainian society from the inside. The soldiers at the front, particularly the volunteers who signed up straight away when the war started, had been in the trenches for 3 years with no possibility of rotation. We don't have the exact figures, but we can assume that half of this initial million were seriously wounded or killed and are therefore no longer at the front line. So the entire burden of the war falls on the shoulders of the same people. And of course, they expect the government to take measures to mobilize more men, but there are hardly any people left, or a few people left in the rear who would be ready to be mobilized for several reasons. Unlike Russia, for example, which has a sufficient number of individuals who are either impoverished and cynical, who are afraid of the state, who are maybe fed by a feeling of resentment, the resentment of a lost empire. Compared to this, Ukraine has the distinct disadvantage of a more democratic, but also a lot weaker state than Russia. What's worse, there is a shortage of chronic shortage of ammunition. People see that the allies, Western allies, are not determined to help Ukraine to actually win, which means that the war could last a very long time. And if it is the case, who would want to go to the front and spend the rest of their lives in the trenches? And if sending weapons is so difficult and slow, well, ordinary Ukrainians feel that they are fighting and dying with just twisted arms. But at the same time, this is the situation which is very hard for the Ukrainian society, but there is nothing like a desire just to give up altogether and to make peace on the Putin's terms, because, as I said, previous experience have shown that any freezing of the front line is interpreted by Russia exclusively as an opportunity to rearm and relaunch a stronger offensive. This is exactly what happened between the first invasion of 2014 and the second 2022. So people are at the same time aware that making peace in Russian terms means that they are going to find themselves in the trenches anyway, but perhaps a few years later. And yeah, so you may have noticed, as me, that there is an increasing talk of forcing Ukraine to accept peace on Russian terms, including among the left. And for Ukrainians, you must understand this kind of call for peace is simply is interpreted as a will to force around 15 million of people to live and die under the occupation of a regime that abolished all rights and freedoms, that rapes, tortures, and slaughters civilians, that kidnaps their children and strips them of their identity. And another 20 million or so will live in a constant threat of being reattacked and reoccupied, meaning that they will live in a highly militarized society. Also, I can imagine this situation, the fate of the few million people in a very distant land may not be a compelling enough argument, as we have seen this in Gaza. And that's understandable. Our capacity of empathy is limited, but this war also has global implications that I believe affect all of us. The lack of support for the victims of any aggression encourages all the countless psychopaths in power, both north and south, east and west, to solve their internal political legitimacy problems with the help of wars, external wars. And the rise of fascism and revanchism on the international arena, which is embodied, I believe, at the moment by the states like Russia and Israel, that states that wage war against other states. It also embodied by regimes like a regime in Belarus, I don't know, Iran, Syria, Myanmar, etc., a regime that wage war against their own people. So the rise of this kind of regimes and their impunity inevitably means that the rise of fascist reactionary forces in every country, forces like AfD in Germany, Rassemblement National in France, Trump in the United States, etc. You cannot let a reactionary revanchist state win a war and expect that this shift of global power balance would not affect your society. So Putin and other right-wing reactionary forces truly believe, I think, that now is the opportune moment for them to shift the balance in their favor, because they think that they have all the necessary advantages. Because who do they see before them? How do they interpret Western societies? They see atomized societies that are unable to find sufficiently convincing reasons to defend their autonomy, societies that are increasingly attracted to paternalistic and isolationist models of social order, and these models are presented as the only alternative in the face of very complex and unpredictable world. And also Putin, with this seemingly local war in Ukraine, is promoting a global project. And he makes it clear that for him, this is a war that aims to impose new global rules, or better to say, the absence of any rules. He says basically, let's stop pretending that there are any rules at all. Let's normalize the right of force, because this is the only legitimate rule that always existed in the world, and it must be like that. And the risk of normalizing this supposedly realistic logic promoted by people like Putin, a logic that denies the necessity to respect any law, is very high, especially now when Israel is destroying Gaza and when the complicity of the United States and also the paralysis of many other countries in the face of this total disrespect of law is for many an evidence of a crisis of confidence. And this is a crisis of such a scale that the very need to maintain any kind of normative order is being called into question. But I must say, and this is my opinion, that in a world without normative foundations, those who are already now in a position of weakness, and who is in a position of weakness, for example, states like Palestine or states like Ukraine, just to give two examples, and political forces that are in position of weakness, for example, as the international left. So these weak actors are going to be destroyed quickly and maybe irrevocably in this struggle where only pure force matters. So to conclude, I think it seems to me that we must try to become aware of the gravity and the complexity of the challenges we face now internationally, and each of us, each of our movement inside our country. And if our only strategy is to erode the current structures without creating the current norms, without creating any convincing and popular alternative to these norms and structures, well, the international left is risking to become just, I don't know, another group of individuals privileged enough to not care about the practical outcomes of our words and deeds, outcomes that are experienced first by those who live on the periphery of the systems, of the capitalist system, by states like Palestine, Ukraine, Syria, etc. And so by experience by those whose voices we do not hear or we do not want to hear. So I will finish here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hanna. Ilya, I invite your comments.
Thank you. So the first thing to begin with is that the current war became for its third year an inherent part of the political regime in Russia. It became a key for its ideology, for its domestic politics, and that's why we have to admit that this war now serves not only, let's say, foreign policy goals, but also the internal goals as the keeping the regime in its current form and its transformation into more open, clearly totalitarian direction. So coming to the Russian perspective in this war, we can see that at first it's the perspective to continue the annexation of the territory of Ukraine. So from the May of this year, we see the failed offensive in Kharkiv. We see the recent Putin demands to take over the whole territory of two Ukrainian regions, such as Zaporizhia and Kherson, and the main goal in the direction of Ukraine for the regime is the control under the whole territory of Ukraine, let's say, the political control under all the territory of Ukraine, under the Ukrainian government and political system. And we can say that in this sense, it presents for Putin a kind of model for the whole post-Soviet space. So now we see that simultaneously with ongoing war in Ukraine, there is the growing political pressure on such countries as Georgia, Moldova, Central Asian states, Armenia. So basically, the main kind of demand for the states is not just refusal of any military cooperation with NATO or with European Union, but let's say rejection of all the package of political and ideological values that are alternative to those values posed by Russia. At first, of course, is democracy as the political form, is any rights of minorities. So, for example, under the Russian pressure in Georgia, in Kyrgyzstan, were implemented new laws on so-called LGBT propaganda, on so-called foreign agents. So we see that Russia proposed the whole package of political and ideological values for the whole post-Soviet states, and Putin is trying to remodel the whole post-Soviet states in let's say ideological direction proposed by Russia. So coming back to Ukraine and at the current moment of this war, it should be admitted that it's really hard to achieve these goals by the military means. So we see that, for example, the recent offensive on Kharkiv was failed, actually. That, for example, if Putin really wants to take over by military means the whole Zaporizhia and Kherson, he probably will need some more 14 years of the war in its current temper, let's say, to achieve these goals. So that's why we see a kind of complicated way of a pressure to Ukraine, which includes not just direct military offensive, but also the wide use of the nuclear threats to European states mostly, but globally as well, and also kind of using the hybrid ways of pressure to the European Union, for example, by using the migration issue. You know that currently you have the growing artificially organized migration pressure on the Polish-Belarusian border. You have the direct involvement of Russia in the European elections, and there are a lot of evidences that Russia was directly involved in support of the AfD alternative for Germany in the last elections. And it's interesting that just a week before the European elections, Putin nearly openly called for support for this party in the elections, and he especially stressed that he doesn't see any elements of Nazism in the current AfD agenda. And of course, the last, let's say, important element of this complicated Putin strategy is basic, let's say, increasing the price of this war for Ukraine and for Europe by massive bombardment of the big cities and infrastructure. So that's why it's not possible to think about the any sustainable peace treaty with Russia under the current regime. So the change of this regime, the transformation of this regime is the like a key element of any possibility of the sustainable peace for Ukraine, with the guarantees of its independence and its security. But it's also important to know that the price of this war is increasing for Russia as well, as we see that Putin is not able to achieve his goals by military means. He needs to spend more and more money. He needs to mobilize all the resources of the country to continue this war, and of course it increased the risks for this regime as well. So just a year ago, we had the mutiny, Prigozhin's mutiny, with 10,000 mercenaries marching to Moscow with some kind of perspective of the coup d'etat. We see the growing dissatisfaction with the war in the Russian society, and I will support in general the assessment of Anna about Russian society, but I want to maybe to add to this that even to the third year of this war, like desire of Putin to mobilize the Russian society, to indoctrinate the Russian society with the goals of this war somehow failed. So you can't say that the most of Russian society is really enthusiastic by this war. You can say that this war is normalized in the mass consciousness, that you have the atmosphere of fear and obedience in the Russian society, but in the same time you can't say that this war is really popular. And that's why Putin's government is trying to avoid the general military conscription in the country. That's why they're still trying to maintain the current size of the army by just by money, just for some kind of financial motivation. So that's why yes, and the third thing is that you have since the beginning of this year the rise of Islamic extremism in Russia. So in March there was the terrorist attack on Crocus City Hall in Moscow, with a lot of people died. And just recently, you had just some week ago, you had the terrorist attack in the region of Dagestan, in the Muslim Caucasian part of Russian Federation, where the group allied with the Islamic State was trying to attack the Orthodox Church and the synagogue in this region, and also dozens of people were killed, including the Orthodox priest. So you can say that this war is also provoke some internal contradictions, the contradictions inherited in the complicated, let's say, ethnic structure of the Russian Federation, and that's why you can say that even for the Russian government, the perspective of this war is quite unclear. So probably I will stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. So many threads that we can pull together from each of your contributions. And Hanna, I just really was taken with your comment about the limited capacity for empathy for those of us who reside outside of zones of conflict and are somewhat privileged in our position. I think that is a beautiful way of putting something that is really a part of the political problem, as Simon started out. So in different ways, you each mentioned something around civil society responses that are unique opportunities. Simon, you referenced the student encampment movements in North America, for example, as a new opportunity. There are people still in Ukraine, you reminded us, Hanna, that are determined, though tired. We can understand that, but not tired of the effort, which was a fantastic distinction. Ilya, you raised Georgia and the protests as well. So I'm wondering if each of you could take a moment to think about the war or ending the war, or some kind of broader political movement that is tied to these civil society responses, either directly to Russian authoritarian control, as in Georgia, or further afield, like the student movement in North America. I know that's broad, but I throw it out just to hear your comments and see how that comes together. In any order, whoever would like to start.
Simon, maybe you will go first.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the question of questions and very difficult to answer. And I can only mention our experience in London. I talked about these big demonstrations and how we'd gone with the banner, Ukraine, and from Ukraine to Palestine, occupation is a crime. On the base of that, a group of our younger friends started an organization called Unite the Struggles. They worked together also with the trade unionist from Sudan who's living in the UK, who's in exile. They made contact with some people who are in exile from Syria, and we had a couple of Zoom calls and a meeting, where we were in person, speaking about the complicated relationship between these different struggles. Also, there was a good comrade there from Kashmir, who's now based in London, who faces the aggression of the Indian state under Modi. So that discussion is happening, and I suppose I see. I think there's potential there. I go on these demonstrations, and I spend a lot of time thinking about the fact that there are a lot of people there who are doing what I was doing as a teenager in relation to the war in Vietnam. But I think the world that that generation lives in is very different. I think there's climate change, which wasn't there when we were young. There's no Soviet Union. There's no communist parties in the way that there was when we were young. There's the official labor movement is very different in some of the Western countries, the UK included, although obviously there are other places in the world where it's expanding and sprouting. So it's very different. And I suppose a danger for our generation is to try to is to try to impose our experiences and impose what's in our heads from that experience on this new generation. They come in from a different angle, and I don't pretend to know really what that angle is, but I think there has to be a conversation between those generations. I feel that's very important.
Probably I will add that of course the rise of the Palestinian solidarity movement in US it's a great achievement. It's a great change in the US politics, but I will say that probably the question of possibility of dialogue and more broader perspective, like global perspective of this movement is still there. Because, for example, when I had some experience of like conversations with the participants of the US encampments, I heard like many times the idea that okay, so our global program is that US should withdraw from everywhere. So, okay, I can agree with that, but if you like reduce the variety of imperialist conflicts in the world to this perspective, so it means that some kind of war of Ukraine was also organized by United States, and this problem could be solved if US will withdraw from Ukraine in the same way as from support of Israel and from other parts of the world. So on the other side, for example, for us as the Russian left as exile, conflict in Palestine raised some problems with the liberal part of the Russian anti-war opposition, which mostly sided with Israel in a very disgusting way, an ignorant way, and of course it's also come from the very narrow-minded kind of perspective of Russian liberal opposition. So that's why I think that the possibility of the broader like dialogue between the various like movements, including, for example, the movement against this foreign agent law in Georgia, is very much needed, because that movement in Georgia is also extremely important. So you had some 10% of Georgian population which were involved in this protests, and most of this population, most of these participants of this protest, they're young people, students who were organized in their universities. So there is a clear like social and, let's say, political ground for common struggles and common program with such movements as Georgian movement, Georgian protest movement, and US student encampments. But to make this dialogue possible, you need to educate people, and you need to break with this very narrow and very, let's say, nation-centered view that unfortunately you have in the US, as well as in Russian immigration or among the majority of the Georgian opposition.
Well, I don't know, do you want me to add something? Actually, everything was more or less said. I agree with what Ilya said, actually. About the civil society responses, if we talk about Ukraine and what is happening inside of Ukraine, well, you have so many things to say about this. As I mentioned, the Ukrainian state was and is still a weak state. and it was its curse and also its advantage in comparison to the Russian state, because of course it created a lot of problems. It was a state that was hardly capable of offering a sufficient social security to its citizens. So also it provoked an understandable nostalgia for the Soviet times and for the paternalistic order that characterized this period among an important part of the population. But at the same time, this weakness of the state gave a potential, or had created a space for developing a potential to organize from below. And that's what we've seen with the start of the invasion, how quickly the Ukrainian civil society started to self-organize and to sustain its existence, not relying on the state. But still, these movements from below, I cannot say that, yes, they are important, very important for the survival of the communities, but still, can we consider them as being a rise of a political awareness as we understand it, especially in the Western countries? Like most of the Ukrainians in Ukraine and the Ukrainian refugees here, we have hard times to organize them politically and to actually convince that people can self-organize in a way that goes beyond the needs of their direct community, be it a village or a town or a professional organization or something. So there is for the whole of the post-Soviet diasporas also, because I live in a diaspora, to talk about joining articulated movement with other communities. It's not easy actually to organize these people, and I think one of the reasons is the Soviet experience, which created a very atomized and fragmented societies, and the post-Soviet experience of savage capitalism that destroyed even the notion of solidarity. So it's a very contradictory situation actually. So yeah, but just to say that we have what I have seen, the potential is coming from the movements on the left and the progressive movements in the Western societies and also non-Western societies themselves. They can articulate and have a global vision of how the imperialist wars are connected to our internal problems, internal rise of far right. And actually, I think the awareness of this is actually rising, especially when we see the result of elections in many European countries. I think people start to understand that these things are interconnected. And for me, this is a moment where we can actually we can actually, this is the moment that we must use in order to do what Ilya said, in order to educate people.
Absolutely. And I think, Hanna, that your comments lead into some of the questions that are coming in from the audience, in some ways looking for both a retrospective and a in the future type discussion about the actual demographic within Crimea and Ukraine more broadly. So one of the questions is just asking, how were the Donbass paramilitaries behaving before the invasion, and what, I guess, role that played? And sort of a tied question, not sure it's the same individual, what is the demographic makeup of Crimea, and how is that going to impact any possible outcomes of the war, looking very internally now? And so I'm going to throw it back to you, Hanna, if you're comfortable, but also open to the panel as a whole.
Yes, I would also be happy if any Ilya or Simon would also comment on these issues. I must admit they are, I'm not a specialist on this question, but I will try to say what I know. and to try to interpret what actually people who asked this question were meaning. So about the Donbas paramilitaries, I suppose that people are talking about the self-proclaimed republics of Donetsk and Luhansk that were occupied by Russia, although it was an unofficial occupation, but de facto occupation of these regions that existed as unrecognized republics that were not annexed by Russia and that were existing in somehow kind of a gray zone from the points of view of international law and also of law in general. So we can characterize them as being gray zones with countless possibilities for mafia, paramilitaries, for anybody who want to not respect rules and to actually exploit the economic potential of this region that was still quite high in Ukraine, but during these 10 years it was completely dismantled by these local mafias. So how were they behaving? That's a very vast question. Like they were, I think, adapting to the situation, and it was quite a comfortable position for many of these warlords and others who replaced them, because you need to understand the first generation of paramilitaries in Donbas, the actual warlords, were destroyed actually by Wagner Group, by Russia itself, in order to put their reliable Russia-affiliated person who would control this region. About the demographic makeup of Crimea, I saw the statistics, but I'm not sure about the sources of it. About 300,000, at least 300,000 of Russian citizens moved to Crimea after the annexation, and now they live in Crimea. So yes, and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens moved out of Crimea, and the biggest proportion of those who moved out are Crimean Tatars, so a Muslim population of Turk population of Crimea. That it was persecuted, that was highly pro-Ukrainian in the moment of annexation, that was persecuted brutally by the Russian regime all this time, and is still persecuted for their political positions, but also on the pretext of their religious affiliation with extremist, so-called extremist groups, Islamist groups, which are not considered as such in other countries, but in Russia, yes. So that demographically, I think the situation shifted a lot, and you need to understand this is not only a question of Crimea. Russia had put a deliberate policy of the replacement of population on the occupied territories, and after the invasion, this policy was a lot more intense than what it had done in Crimea before, especially in destroyed cities like Mariupol. People were deported or just left the city when there were active battles there, but also because 90% of the infrastructure of the city is completely destroyed. So a lot of Ukrainians moved out of these zones, were deported from Russia to Russia, or then moved to Europe. So what you see now is a astonishing, cynical policy of actually rebuilding the city, of destroying the evidences of war crimes and moving Russian citizens there on a very low prices. So there will be a huge issue if these territories are actually liberated by the Ukrainian army and are reintegrated into Ukraine. It is a huge question of how to deal with the population who moved since, and I don't think there is a simple answer. And I think also you need to keep the eye have a very strong norms imposed on the Ukrainian army when it comes to the civilian population, even if they are not Ukrainian citizens, their treatment of the civilian population, because, you know, the hate is rising on the both sides. So I think there may be a risk of the bad treatment of the civil population, but still on the territories that are liberated by the Ukrainian army, we didn't witnessed any mass crimes or ethnic cleansing by the Ukrainian army. But when it comes to the territories that are under the occupation for 10 years and more, and where the demographic composition of the population was changed, well, we need to be very, very aware of the risks.
I'll just add, if I may, Sandra, I think this is such an important issue, and over really the last 10 years, I was trying to follow it. I think there's very little good information in English about what's happening in the occupied areas. It's always worth friends who are on the call looking at the website of the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Group, which has pages in English. I write about those areas on my blog. I have done for many years, and the reason I've done that is because I think it explains to friends here who perhaps have never visited Ukraine or Russia and don't fully understand the dynamics. That is what that's the nature of the Russian invasion. You can see in these areas that Russia has occupied since 2014, the nature of rule, this arbitrary rule by a gang of thugs, essentially, in both of these so-called republics, which has been perpetrated for many years. The use of prison labor is completely illegal under international human rights law, which was covered by the Eastern Human Rights Group, and also the Eastern Human Rights Group is one, but I mean that the work that activists have continued. I always remember in 2017, the feminist march that was organized in Lysychansk, in the very close to where the front line was at that time, and the organizing that continued across the front line, which was possible then, it's not possible now. So I think that's very important, and that Ukrainians who are fighting at the front well understand from what they know about what's happening in those areas, what would await anyone who further came under Russian occupation. And it's our job really to make that clear to people here in every way that we possibly can.
Ilya, would you like to add?
Maybe just very, very briefly. So on the question of paramilitaries in Donbass before the full-scale invasion, I think Anna already mentioned quite correctly that those leaders of paramilitaries who had any sort of their own agency, they were killed or somehow alienated by the Russian authorities long before the full-scale invasion. And to the moment of the invasion, basically there was not such a thing as the paramilitaries somehow independent or not fully dependent from the Russian authorities. So I think it's better to say just that these territories they were under the full Russian military and political control before the invasion. So the second thing is about Crimea. So it's not just about makeup, but it's about, let's say, the political situation in Crimea, because when it was annexed in 2014, so you can say that some significant part of, let's say, Russian-speaking population there, they were quite enthusiastic about this, not just because of their pro-Russian or whatever anti-Ukrainian sentiments, but also because of, let's say, peaceful character of this annexation. For now, when you have the like Ukrainian strikes on military bases in Crimea, when Crimea becoming more and more involved in this war as a territory, so it's really hard to say what are the real feelings of its inhabitants, even if they were quite pro-Russian some 10 years ago. And it's important to mention that now in Crimea you have much more systematic and serious scale of repressions than even in the Russian Federation, let's say. So any public sentiments, not just critical to the war or critical to the government, but let's say sounds suspicious for the current moment, that could lead you immediately to a high prison term in Crimea. And if you follow the current level of repressions there, it's really impressive, even if you compare it with the level of repressions in Russian Federation.
Very good, thank you. So I know this is on people's minds and it was on their television last night, but there are a few elections happening that also seem to have implications for the conflict, for war, for Ukraine, what supports it's going to receive from the West. So this is speculative, I guess, at this moment, but what might we expect from the French election outcome, from what's happening in the United States? Simon, you sort of teased us with this in your opening comments. I know everyone is really concerned about Canada. It's been mentioned many times today. It's just a Canadian inside joke. But there are real issues around the elections and what seems to be a very concerted right-wing drift across Europe and in North America. So what will happen? What does your crystal ball tell you? Ayman? Or Ilya, you haven't gone first. We've put you in the sweeping role.
Okay, so the first thing to say that of course Putin's Russia is very much relying on possible Trump's victory in US. They are quite welcoming the recent Trump's proposals on the peace treaty, possible peace treaty with Russia, and also his perspective on NATO, on European security, and so on. But of course, if you are like monitoring the Russian official media that I'm trying to do like regularly, you can see that they are trying to distance themselves from the open like support of Trump, and I think that's the way to avoid the further accusations for the Russian involvement in U.S. elections. As for Europe, you see this involvement in a much more open way. I already mentioned about Germany, but also I think France is the case. Also, you see some direct involvement of Russia in support of various far right forces in the Eastern Europe, in countries like Slovakia, or of course Hungary is important Russian ally. And I think it's not only it's not only a political strategy to weaken the European Union, to weaken the support of Ukraine, but it's definitely has an ideological character, and it's very much related to the common, let's say, values, because as Anna already pointed in the beginning, Putin has a certain view on how the international relations should be reorganized globally. And so, of course, that is the perspective of the removal of the international law of all the institutions like United Nations, European Union, and so on, and to bring pure nationalist perspective, nationalist agenda. So I think in this sense, it's not only a question of the current cynical manipulation, but it's very strategical from let's say ideological point of view.
Yeah, well, I may add some something about France first, because I'm living in a French speaking region, so I follow mostly what is happening in France. Well, there are some, of course, a very, very, how to say, dangerous and very frightening tendencies. Like France was always proud of its republican traditions and values, and what we see now is the rise of extreme right group, which is, I mean, saying very frightening and radical things, including not just on Ukraine or international policy, but especially when it comes to the issues of migration inside of France. And these propositions, when I hear them, I just cannot believe that I'm living with these people like side to side. And this is something which is not properly understood even in the French society itself. But as you know, the French president has dissolved the parliament, and he called for elections, early elections, and I think he by doing this he was trying to win the game in a strange way. What we see that when the left was confronted with this threat, the left-wing parties in France, they tried to put aside their disagreements, and they had united themselves in what is called a new popular front. And this coalition brings together forces that had and have, I suppose, very divergent positions on the issue of the Russian war in Ukraine. The Communist Party and La France Insoumise of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, one of the most outstanding and figures of the French left. They had a quite vicious position on what is happening in Ukraine since the first invasion of 2014. They were voicing quite pro-Russian positions and were very dismissive and very cynical towards Ukraine and the Ukrainian population. But they signed the program of a new popular front, where, as I understand it, other left-wing forces, center left and the radical left of Trotskyist background, have forced a position on Ukraine, which actually states that their front, their coalition, want to hold the Vladimir Putin accountable for this war, for the war crimes. They are on the side of Ukraine that defend the sovereignty and the integrity of its borders. They are in favor of confiscating the assets of Putin's oligarchs, etc. But it must be noted that this was a position that was imposed upon some of the left French left parties that didn't share this vision before. But at the same time, it's a good sign that for a French politics, this is something very important to see all the progressivist force unite in the same coalition, and I really hope that it will help to to cut the possibility of the far right to taking power in France, because France is just one of the most powerful European countries, and also in terms of military help for Ukraine. In just a few comments that goes in the same direction of what just Ilya said, that Putin actually and his support for the far right, including in this election, and I was astonished to see in the Russian propaganda how actually open are they about their solidarity with this openly pro-fascistic and even sometimes neo-Nazi forces, and I didn't expect them to be so honest actually, on this. But this is something which, on one side, yes, is aimed to destabilize the Europe, and also it has some deep ideological solidarity, because people like Putin are convinced that they know the way how to ensure the world peace, and this is a very simple way. Just to ensure peace, let's just divide the world, redivide the world between big players, between empires, and the eternal peace will come. But also there are enemies who make this project of the eternal peace impossible. And who are the enemies in the minds of people like Vladimir Putin and his allies? These are liberal and the so-called cultural Marxists, wokeists. This is just the same enemy for them, because they promote what they see as the destructive ideas, the ideas of, the human rights, liberty, equality, rights of minorities, and for what? Why are they doing this? Of course, they are doing this, and their only aim is to ensure the hegemony of the United States and to constrain the elites of other great powers like Russia, to constrain them in their right to have a piece of this world cake. Of course, they consider that this piece is rightfully belongs to them by nature. So this kind of ideology is quite prominent in Russia, and I think it can be shared by many radical nationalist and right-wing forces. So it goes beyond just a tactical alignment.
Thank you. And Simon, you have an election that's imminent. You're okay? I'm attentive to the time and really appreciate the questions. What I would propose is, one, I have been asked by the organizers to highlight for the audience that if you are interested in being part of solidarity efforts, learning more about the war and things that you might be able to do locally, that you can go to the Ukrainian Solidarity Network.us. That's all one word. And hopefully that appears somewhere on the YouTube site, so you can also access it in that regard. I'm very appreciative of the insights and comments that have been provided by the panelists. If you would like to take 1 to 2 minutes, I will tell you one of the themes that comes through the questions is, how can we act, whether that's through the labor movement or through other solidarity organizations, and what is the best way that we might support Ukraine at this time? And so you can answer that, you can wrap up in any way you see fit, but I just ask that you keep your comments to 1 to 2 minutes. Simon, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Sandra. And it's been a very good discussion and very worrying when not in the great situation. And I'm just going to repeat what I said to a Ukrainian friend we met at an event a couple of weeks ago here in London. You know, we are witnessing the collapse of empires, and you know, nobody ever said that that could look pretty. It does not look pretty, and it doesn't feel pretty to live through it. And I think we need to keep in mind while dealing with these these short-term questions like the ones Anna was talking about, which seem very, very grim, about the rise of the far right and all these other things. We need to keep a perspective about the larger picture, which despite all of that, also contains reasons for hope.
So but I would support Simon, and I would add that, of course, international left should support the right of Ukraine to defend itself in any way, but I think that is not enough. Yes, it's not enough to support the supply of arms, but also what is really needed from the international left is the alternative program, let's say, of the sustainable peace and the guarantees of security of Ukraine and other, let's say, small nations of Europe, and not only Europe. So it's absolutely not the case of the left just to say that okay, US should withdraw from everywhere and all the problems will be solved like automatically. I think that this perspective is very dangerous. It's not a true internationalist perspective, but it's nationalist perspective. It's very kind of nation-centered perspective, and it's has absolutely nothing with the real responsibility of the left if they pretend to be real internationalists. So to be a real internationalist is to propose the global alternative. And now, of course, the one of the key issues for this global alternative is the like peace project, alternative peace project for Ukraine and, let's say, European security in general.
Thank you. I agree with what was just said, and I would just add that the important thing for me to keep in mind is that this aggression in Ukraine was made, and not just in Ukraine, but in Ukraine in particular, was made possible by impunity, because Russia had already committed crimes of aggression and war crimes in other countries, in Chechnya, in Syria, and these crimes have never been considered like important enough to stop actually trading with Russia. I think so. We need to act against this idea or this normality where actually the freedom to trade is put above the lives of victims of aggression, and actually above the lives of all of us, because to continue to trade with these autocratic states destroys the future of the oppressed, exploited, and aggressed people, and it also destroys our common future as a humanity, because it destroys the condition of life on Earth. Why we are so dependent on Russia? Because we base our lives on the consumption of fossil fuels. And for me, this is a very important connection to make. And in this world of competing imperialist states that some people call an emerging multipolar world, but just competing imperialism. I think the least we can make is to actually listen and to amplify the voices of ordinary people who struggle against the oppression, against the external aggression, and to pay attention to these voices and not the voices of those who pretend to speak on their behalf, be they from the global north or global south. I think it should be clear that neither in the north or south, east and west, there are no state elites that have some progressive democratic project of global order, and it is for us, even if the deadline to think about these issues was yesterday, I think we still need to propose our vision of the common future, and this vision of the common future can only be achieved in common action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, Ilya, Hanna. This was a really wonderful, thought-provoking, and actually inspiring. It was nice to hear a hopeful comment as well. Thank you all, and thank you for taking the time as an audience to join us today. Take care.
Thank you.